Hey, no, my listeners, this week I want to talk about transhumanism, and specifically I want to frame this conversation in the context of some literature, some books, some writings that have been around for a long time, because if we understand the core questions that human beings have been trying to answer, the problems that humans have been trying to solve almost since the beginning of time, we will understand our own time so much better. And get this, transhumanism isn't new. Well, at least the core questions that transhumanism is trying to answer are not new to humanity. So for a little preview in this conversation, I'm going to reference ancient Greek literature, specifically Sophocles. I'm going to reference J.R.R. Tolkien, one of my favorite authors, and C.S. Lewis. And then we're going to tie that into what many leaders on the cutting edge of technology today think the CEOs of major AI and tech companies are saying, and realize that it all ties in together. Maybe we'll even understand a little bit better what we believe about our own death and mortality and the future of our souls. Okay, that sounds really big, but those are all tangential to the conversation of transhumanism, and it's relevant. Maybe you haven't really heard this term before, but I actually noticed when I was researching for this episode that there was an article published in the New York Post, I believe, on transhumanism specifically just a few days ago. So it is getting to be more common in our cultural vernacular. We're learning about this topic more. And so I thought it'd be a good time to just break it down because it's becoming more relevant to our lives as we talk about AI and technology and the future and what all of that means for us. So let's jump into it. First, I'm going to borrow from this great booklet right here. It's called Do You Want to Live Forever? A Tolkienian Critique of Transhumanism. Now, I mentioned I love J.R.R. Tolkien. I've probably mentioned that on the No Why podcast before. If you're a Tolkien fan, if you like The Lord of the Rings, guess what? He was writing about transhumanism all the way back when he wrote The Lord of the Rings. So The Lord of the Rings just got even cooler, and we're going to be talking about that. But this is written by Julie Miller, who I actually interviewed on the Point of View Radio talk show on this booklet specifically. I'll link it. You can get this little physical copy in the mail, or you can download a digital version of it. And what she does is really critique transhumanism, but she does so by using a lot of what Tolkien wrote about because there is so much overlap there. So I'll get into more details about that, but she has a good concise definition of transhumanism that I am going to read here because it'll help us understand what we're even talking about. Transhumanists envision a techno-utopian society referred to as a triple S civilization of super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness, a future where there is a gradual blurring of the traditional boundaries between human persons and machines. So this essentially is the idea that human beings can, should, will at some point merge with machines, merge with technology. So to bring this home a little bit to stuff that we already are hearing about in the news, this could be something like Neuralink, which is created by Elon Musk's company, and it has to do with a brain-computer interface, or BCI, basically like chips, implants in your brain. There are already some people who have these. They are right now being prioritized for people who have disabilities, like a paraplegic person, for example, and it will help them have a little more autonomy. So there are uses like that, but they're even talking about making this available to the general public so that you don't have to type on your phone to send a text message. You can just think it without even saying it, and it's automatically connected. Now, I'm just going to say right out the gate, there are so many rabbit holes we could go down and the whole episodes and conversations we could have about all the little things that I'm going to mention here, but we're just trying to understand transhumanism in general. So that's one example of transhumanism that is kind of already happening even now. But there are other more extreme examples that maybe you've heard about, maybe you didn't really think it was real or plausible, but for instance, uploading one's mind or brain or consciousness to the cloud, basically preserving that or digitizing one's consciousness so that it is released from the aging physical body. That's something we'll talk about more. So those are all examples of transhumanism. Now, Julie Miller gives a little bit more of an explanation, so I'm going to quote that as well. She says that transhumanism core tenets are extensions of three historical ideas. And this is where it all ties into stuff that I mentioned a minute ago, where we really have been after the same thing forever as a human race. But the three historical ideas: a desire to control nature and the human condition, a mechanistic and materialist picture of the world, and a technological view of progress. So I think we can see all of those things today, right? A lot of us live, even if we believe in God, we live as if we are materialist, basically like everything that we can see and manipulate with our hands and control in nature, like that is reality. And so that tends to drive a lot of decisions in our culture and in modern society, because people aren't really taking the spiritual aspect of things into account. And then a technological view of progress. I mean, we definitely see that today. That's the argument where you are seeing, like, from the Enlightenment to the Industrial Revolution to today with the AI revolution, people saying this is just progress. Every new tool that we invent or make or discover is neutral. We just have to use it. This is inevitable. We are progressing and technology is our friend, which technology itself isn't bad. But again, that's another rabbit hole that we could go down. My Tolkien mug for the conversation today, as you can see. So that gives us an idea of what transhumanism is and a little bit of how it's connected to the past or certain desires that humans have had for a long time. And so maybe you're thinking, well, that's great. Now I know what that is, what that belief system or philosophy or ideology is. But let's make it tangible to today, because like I said, there are multiple people, individuals who are really kind of the power players right now in the technological revolution that we're seeing happening around us today with AI and even things like space travel. And they are advocating this ideology as well. So I'm going to give you a few recent examples. This is from Elon Musk. He said this in 2017, actually. So this is something that we might just be learning about if we haven't been on the cutting edge of, technology and research and everything for many, many years. And maybe you have, but many of us are really just learning about all of this stuff within the last few years. But back in 2017, Elon Musk said, "Over time, I think we will probably see a closer merger of biological intelligence and digital intelligence. It's mostly about the bandwidth, the speed of the connection between your brain and the digital version of yourself, particularly output." So he's saying, like, yes, this is going to happen. We're going to see this merge, and it really is just a matter of timing and question of speed and how fast this can happen. Okay, so another example is Peter Thiel, who you've probably heard of. Peter Thiel is the founder or co-founder of PayPal. He also, I believe, launched Palantir Technologies, or co-founded that, serves there as chairman. So he's a tech entrepreneur and investor. And so he's somebody else who has really advocated a transhumanist ideology. So recently, or fairly recently, he did an interview with Ross Douthat, who is the podcast host of Interesting Times. And so here's just a little clip or quote from that interview. And Douthat said, "I think you would prefer the human race to endure, right?" Thiel hesitates. Douthat says, "You're hesitating." Thiel says, "Well, I don't know." Douthat says, "That's a long hesitation." Thiel, "There's so many questions implicit in this." Douthat says, "Should the human race survive?" Thiel says, "Yes, but," and here's his quote, "I would also like us to radically solve these problems." And so it's always, I don't know, transhumanism. The ideal was this radical transformation where your human natural body gets transformed into an immortal body. He goes on to say, "We want you to be able to change your heart and change your mind and change your whole body." So he's definitely advocating this. Another example is Sam Altman, who you might know as the leader of OpenAI, which is the company that has ChatGPT. And so this is where we get an example of even more extreme. So Sam Altman has actually paid $10,000 of a down payment to be placed on a wait list for a service by a company called Netcomb. So this is from a MIT Technology Review article. Netcomb is a preserve your brain and upload it company. Its chemical solution can keep a body intact for hundreds of years, maybe thousands, as a statue of frozen glass. The idea is that someday in the future, scientists will scan your bricked brain and turn it into a computer simulation. That way, someone a lot like you, though not exactly you, will smell flowers again in a data server somewhere. So this is a startup company, really exists, that, if you've heard about people saying upload your mind to the cloud and things like that, this is basically like that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to preserve your brain so that someday it can, your consciousness, your memories can be digitized and then re-uploaded. But in order for this to work, your brain has to be fresh. So long story short, you have to be euthanized in order to receive this procedure. So right now, they are talking about first using it for people who might have terminal illness. Okay, so they're about to die anyway. They can be euthanized through this company, and their brain is preserved so that someday their consciousness can reemerge in a digitized format. But there are many people who believe that this isn't just for the terminally ill, but actually the way of the future. And you can put a down payment down right now to reserve your spot to receive this service in the future. One of the people who has done that is Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI. So here was what Altman told MIT Technology Review. I assume my brain will be uploaded to the cloud. And he says that minds will be digitized in his lifetime. That's what he believes. Of course, he's super rich. He's on the cutting edge of all this stuff. So not super surprising that he would be one of the ones to sign up for this service because, hey, that's inevitable. That's where we're headed. So this is a prime example of kind of the ultimate example of transhumanism, where a lot of people think that this philosophy is going, where they think the human race is headed, is that we will literally merge with technology to the point of enhancing our physical body or even completely eradicating it. Now, before I go on to kind of tie this into some of the literature that I was talking about, I want to pause and recall something I talked about a few episodes ago in the episode on Your Story of Reality. And that's where I talked about the worldview grid, and I borrowed this from Nancy Pearcey, but it really helps us to understand somebody else's worldview or outlook on life. So if you'll remember, the worldview grid is 3 questions. And if you can understand somebody's answer to those 3 questions, it helps you make sense of their worldview or their philosophy, their take on life. So those 3 questions are: number 1, origin. Where did everything start? Where specifically did humans come from? Number 2, what went wrong? Everybody believes that at some point something went wrong. So if you can identify what went wrong according to somebody's story of reality, then that gives you a big clue into how they're going to try to solve that problem. And of course, the 3rd question is, how do we solve the problem? How do we redeem? How do we restore? How do we undo what went wrong? So every different religion, every different political ideology even, has answers to those 3 questions that help you understand what that worldview is. So for transhumanism, we can use that worldview grid to really have a better understanding of why they're doing this. Because there's money involved. There's the power aspect. There's the, we can, so we are going to, but it is deeper than that. There are real reasons that people are buying into transhumanism. And I think a lot of people may actually buy into this, but the people who are leading on the technological front, and they have the means and they have the companies and they have the funding to explore all of this, they happen to be the ones that buy into transhumanism. And so they're advancing what they think is a good cause. They're advancing what they think is the future, is the necessary next step. Well, why is that? The Darwinian origin story fits really well into transhumanism for a lot of people because it assumes that humans evolved, that we got here by the survival of the fittest, by natural selection. And so many people believe that transhumanism, merging human beings, biology with technology, is just the next phase of evolution. And in some sense, some people might even believe that it is humans kind of taking the reins in evolution and no more natural selection, but now we are going to choose our next evolutionary step in order to not go extinct, and we are going to merge with technology. So what went wrong in this story is that human bodies, biology, breaks down. So there may be some transhumanists like, Peter Thiel, he uses a lot of Christian verbiage in what he talks about. I don't believe that he actually understands Christianity based on a lot of what he says, but he does frame it that way. So some transhumanists may believe in a version of sin or sin nature, which obviously we understand from the biblical version of reality, right? But I don't think for many of them you even have to acknowledge sin. You just have to acknowledge the effects of sin. What I know to be the effects of sin, which is a broken world. That's aging, that's sickness, people dying, physical death. That's the enemy. That's the problem to solve. And if you don't believe that God created the world and that he created human beings intentionally and that everything was perfect at first and that sin entered the world and brought death and destruction with it, then physical death, aging, sickness, all of that is just inherent in the world, in the physical world. And it is just another evolutionary problem that we have to overcome. And so technology is going to help us do that. So that's the problem. And that's, again, the answer. How do we solve all of this? Well, we overcome biology. We conquer biology. We conquer the human body, and we conquer the problems that come with the human body, including aging, sickness, and physical death. So also, it's important to note here that if you are trying to achieve immortality in this world, if you are trying to extend human life or human consciousness so that you're not bound to the limits of an aging, sick, imperfect, ultimately dying body, then do you believe in an afterlife? Do you believe in a human soul? Well, that kind of goes back to the definition we talked about a minute ago, which is a very materialistic view of reality, meaning what we can see and touch right now is all there is. So that worldview grid helps us understand transhumanists and that they really are trying to solve what they believe is the ultimate problem, the ultimate enemy, aging, sickness, ultimately death, right? Okay. Now, this is where we get to bring in some of the ancient stuff, which I think is really interesting and I think is fun. This problem to solve is not new. It's almost as old as time. And I say almost because I believe what I believe to be the true story of reality, which is that human beings were created and designed intentionally, that the earth was designed with love, and that it was designed to be perfect, and that human beings, when we rebelled against what God told us and we decided that we wanted to live separate from God's plan, that's when sin entered the world and that's when things broke it down. And there is restoration that's possible, but pretty early on in the story, sin entered the world. So that's why I say almost from the beginning of time, human beings and human civilizations and communities, they've been trying to solve this problem of why are we dying? And so even in the earliest written story that human beings have, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the protagonist, Gilgamesh, is trying to solve the problem of death. His best friend dies. It shatters his world so much that he goes on a quest, an epic journey to try to find the secret to immortal life so that he can live forever and escape painful death. And so this was carved onto a tablet in ancient Mesopotamia. So literally, as long as people have been able to write down stories, they have been asking this question of how do we solve the problem of death? Now let's fast forward a while to something that happened more recently than Gilgamesh, but still ancient to us, and that's the ancient Greek culture. So I've talked about this book before, Christians Reading Classics by Nadia Williams. I've interviewed her on the Know Why podcast. I interviewed her on this book specifically for Point of View Radio Talk Show. And in her chapter on ancient Greek drama, she talks about Sophocles and the play Antigone. And there is an ode or a song there that the chorus would sing called Ode to Man. You may have heard of it, but when I read it in this book, I was just struck by how much it reminded me of transhumanists today and this ideology today that so many people adopt when it comes to new technology, even like AI, because once again, we see this theme of human beings trying to conquer nature, trying to overcome our limits. So let me read a passage of Ode to Man to you. Numberless wonders, terrible wonders, walk the world, but none the match for man. That great wonder crossing the heaving gray sea, driven on by the blast of winter, on through breakers crashing left and right, holds his steady course. And the oldest of gods he wears away, the earth, immortal, the inexhaustible, as his plows go back and forth year in, year out, with the breed of stallions turning up the furrows. And speech and thought, quick as the wind, and the mood and mind for law that rules the city, all these he has taught himself, and shelter from the arrows of the frost, when there's rough lodging under the cold clear sky and the shafts of lashing rain, ready, resourceful man, never without resources, never an impasse as he marches on the future. Only death. From death alone he will find no rescue, but from desperate plagues he has plotted his escapes. So, this ode to man, this celebration of the prowess of humankind, talks about how man has essentially conquered nature. And this is, again, we're in ancient Greek culture, so we're before modern technology, but already celebrating the numberless wonders of man. They've conquered the sea because men have been able to build ships and cross the ocean. The oldest of gods, talking about earth, that he's conquered with plows by farming, by conquering animals, stallions, how he has come up with laws and language and taught himself how to build shelter, all from the weather. So man has conquered all of these things. Only death. From death alone he will find no rescue. So that is acknowledging man's conquest of nature, which again is tied in this historical this historical quest to conquer nature, to overcome nature, that is, I think, inherent in human beings. Like, human beings have been driven to do this, is being celebrated, but they're lamenting in this ode to man that death is the only thing that has not yet been conquered. But even in that lament, I get a sense or a hint of hoping that someday it can be. And that is really, we see that today. So when I read that, it reminds me so much of the same thing as today, where if you read people who are obsessed with progress, like look at all the things human beings have invented, have built, which it is impressive. And a lot of it is worth celebrating. But if that is all you're looking at, that's your only understanding of reality, is the material world and man's conquest of nature, then of course it makes sense that the next things are even outside of Earth, like space. So that's a whole separate conversation we could have, but also death, mortality. Can human beings conquer that final enemy? Well, if you can escape biology, that's what they're supposing. So it's the same drive, though, that human beings have been singing about and lamenting for a long time. Now I want to fast forward to J.R.R. Tolkien and talk about what Julie Miller writes about in her booklet, and how Tolkien really was critiquing this idea of transhumanism even when he was writing The Lord of the Rings. So Tolkien is quoted here saying, "Death is not the enemy. Instead, the enemy is the hideous peril of confusing true immortality with limitless serial longevity. And that's what he wrote about. So if you're familiar with The Lord of the Rings, you know that there are different races of beings. There are elves, there are men. And so if you really want to get into the weeds of the lore, so like into the Silmarillion and other writings beyond just the trilogy of The Lord of the Rings, what you need to understand is that elves' life, they have what we call immortality, but it was really serial longevity. Their very being, their whole being, their soul was tied up with Arda, which was the created world in Tolkien's fantasy realm. Now, humans, or what he calls man, they obviously, as we know from watching, if you've watched the trilogy, they're not immortal. Their physical bodies die, but they know, or they're supposed to know, that their spirit will then go on to live in what we might consider an afterlife, a version of heaven, something like that. So even though their physical bodies die, they know where their spirit is going to go. For the elves, their spirit is tied up with the created world. So what's interesting, and this goes back into societies within the Tolkien universe that precede what we know from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, is there has always been this jealousy among men to have the longevity, what they perceive as immortality that the elves have. And yet the elves are often jealous of what they call the gift of death that men have, because elves don't have the release of physical death where then they get to go on and their spirit has an afterlife in a perfect world, but they are tied up with the world. So it's like they live for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, however long, the world that they're created in and tied up with exist, and they see war, they see a death, they see their friends die, they see all these things, and so they're weary. And so if you watch only the trilogy, then you see that when they go off to the Undying Lands, you might assume like, okay, well, that's like heaven. Actually, that's still part of Arda. That's not Middle Earth, but it's still part of the created Earth. It's just inaccessible to certain races most of the time. But even that, while it's better than Middle Earth, is not ultimately like an eternal afterlife. And so the elves are just stuck basically in Arda forever. They don't know what comes next. Men have been given the gift of death where their physical body can die and then they can go and live in the afterlife. But what we see throughout Tolkien's writings in the Lord of the Rings trilogy and even before that is a constant desire of men to try to escape their physical death, to try to escape their preordained destiny. And so if you've watched the recent show, The Rings of Power, this goes into the section of Tolkien's legendarium where they are creating these devices that held the promise to men that they could have the kind of immortality, or what Tolkien calls serial longevity, that the elves had. They could escape physical death. It was giving them the promise of escaping the one thing that they just couldn't stand, because it's hard to have faith in an afterlife that you can't see. They want to be able to live forever in the earth as they see the elves doing. I know I gave examples earlier of Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Sam Altman, but there's actually a transhumanist declaration that she quotes from as well that kind of encapsulates everything, all of the different examples that I've given. So let me just read that really quickly as well. We favor a morphological freedom, the right to modify and enhance one's body, cognition, and emotions. This freedom includes the right to use or not to use techniques and technologies to extend life, preserve the self through cryonics, mind uploading, and other means, and to choose further modifications and enhancements. So this is the declaration of the transhumanists, that they can overcome physical death by merging biology with technology. Now, this is where I want to bring in C.S. Lewis. In the early 1940s, he delivered a series of lectures that were turned into this little book, The Abolition of Man, which is so relevant. It's really short. If you haven't read it, you definitely should. And of course, I'll link all of the books and those stories that I'm talking about here in the show notes, as I always do. But in chapter 3 here of this book, which is called The Abolition of Man, it's the titular chapter, he talks about what we mentioned a moment ago with that definition of transhumanism, which is the historical drive of man to conquer nature. Neil Postman also talks about this, like in all of the technologies that we've celebrated, like the telegraph conquered time and space. You could immediately communicate with somebody. So space and time were conquered in that way. And so we see the physical limitations of Earth often as problems to solve. And that's not always a bad thing. We've talked about this on the No I podcast. Human beings, I believe, were created by God with dominion over the earth. We are supposed to steward it and take care of it, but also rule it. And we do that as image bearers of God. So we're supposed to reflect Him by being leaders over creation. But if you don't have a theological underpinning for that, then it can really quickly merge into kind of the vibe that we got from the Ode to Man, which is we are not caring for nature, but we are conquering it. It is a problem to solve. It is a problem to eradicate. It's an enemy to be defeated because it's limiting us. And biology itself is limiting us. This is a lot of what Lewis is critiquing when he writes The Abolition of Man. So let me read a couple passages of that to you. So Lewis is really prophetic here, I think, because he talks about these different technologies, advancements, conquest over nature that are being celebrated as progress. And he's writing in the 1940s, but he's talking about even things like contraception, eugenics, manipulating future generations of humans. I've talked about that on the No I podcast in the past with things like genetic manipulation and engineering with embryos and stuff today to try to select the healthiest ones. He was writing about all of this back in the 1940s and how all of these advancements were presented as being conquests of nature, things that we needed to conquer for the betterment of humanity. But what he talks about is how every time we do that, we are ruling over future generations of man. We're handing them these technologies and determining how they're going to use them. We're actually taking choice away from future generations. It's a really interesting argument. So he said, each new power won by man is a power over man as well. Each advance leaves him weaker as well as stronger. And every victory, besides being the general who triumphs, he is also the prisoner who follows the triumphal car. And then he goes on to say, I am only making clear what man's conquest of nature really means, and especially that final stage in the conquest, which perhaps is not far off. The final stage is come when man, by eugenics, by prenatal conditioning, and by an education and propaganda based on perfect applied psychology, has obtained full control over himself. Human nature will be the last part of nature to surrender to man. The battle will then be won. We shall have taken the thread of life and be henceforth free to make our species whatever we wish it to be. Does that sound like the transhumanism declaration we read a moment ago? The battle will indeed be won. But who precisely will have won it? For the power of man to make himself what he pleases means, as we have seen, the power of some men to make other men what they please. He goes on to argue that as we continue to see humans ourselves as the last thing that we need to conquer, then we are reducing humanity to just another thing in nature, tying back into that materialistic outlook. And so it becomes not a big deal to talk about eradicating, changing the human body. You have to kind of despise your physical body to talk about you can change it into whatever you want. You can completely get rid of it. We don't need it. It just becomes something else to conquer. And he's so right that really what it becomes is the rule of a few hundreds of men over billions upon billions of men. And this is what we're seeing today, is a whole new reality being brought forth by very powerful people who are on the cutting edge of these technological advancements, and their philosophy is transhumanism. And so how does that contrast with a Christian worldview. We've been dropping it in a little bit throughout the conversation, but it goes back to the story of reality, where if you don't acknowledge this, then you don't really have a strong argument, even if something about it, sets off your spidey senses and you're like, I don't like the idea of uploading my mind to the cloud. I don't like the idea that we can just completely change and manipulate and conquer our human body. That seems wrong for some reason. But if you don't believe in anything beyond the physical realm, then why can't people, why can't they try to achieve that if they want to? Well, I think we really do have to go back to, who are we? We're human beings created in the image of God. We were created to be eternal, not just people who live for a really, 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 really long time, as long as the universe exists, but truly forever. And sin is what cut that off in the physical sense. But our souls are still eternal. They always have been, and they always will be. It's about where you're going to spend eternity. And so the story of redemption from the Christian worldview is Jesus, is salvation in Jesus. Salvation is reuniting with God so that you can be with him forever as you were meant to be. And I mentioned this on social media a couple weeks ago, but I just want to, I'm going to link it here, mention again an interview with Ben Sasse, who's a former U.S. senator, but he is going through a very public health struggle right now, to put it mildly. He has stage 4 pancreatic cancer that he was diagnosed with just a few months ago, and he was given only a few months to live. And so he has spent that time being very public and open about what it's like to be, in a terminal stage like that, talking on podcasts, started his own podcast, and he did a wonderful interview with Ross Douthat, who I mentioned earlier, but talking about being ready to die. And he is a Christian. So I contrast that with what we are hearing today from transhumanists, whose whole hope of salvation, of eradicating the problems of the earth, is to try to live as long as possible, even to the extent of being willing to pay thousands and thousands of dollars to eventually be euthanized so that your brain can be embalmed and re-uploaded onto a cloud someday. Saying that human beings, the human race, should only exist if we can eradicate these problems by merging with technology. One is a very desperate grasp to use all the money and power and technology and intelligence that somebody might be able to access in order to maintain or manipulate or change or get rid of the physical body so that their consciousness can last forever. And the other is a very free and open surrender of, I know that I'm going to die, but I also know where I'm going. And I know where salvation truly lies. And I know that someday everything will be restored back to its perfect state as it is supposed to be. And there is just such a stark difference there that I encourage you to look at and check out for yourself. But to wrap it all up, if we want to understand what's happening today, if we want to understand the philosophy of people who are very enthusiastic about all the possibilities of the new technology, the brave new world that we're in, of AI, of brain-computer interfaces, of different ways that we can end up merging technology with humanity, and this kind of like blurring of lines where people are saying, what does it even mean to be human anymore if we can just be part of technology? To understand all of that, we really don't have to understand anything new. We just have to understand the same questions that humans have been asking almost forever, the same problems that human communities and civilizations have been trying to solve almost since the beginning of time. And those are the problems of sickness, of aging, of physical death, knowing that our bodies aren't going to last forever, the ongoing effort to conquer nature. And I think that reading ancient literature gives us insight into that. Reading Tolkien and the way that he framed that whole issue in The Lord of the Rings and the world that he created around that, when you understand that, it becomes so much more relevant, so much more than just a wonderful story to get lost in, but something that was, again, very prophetic and insightful into the ongoing condition of man and the problems that we are trying to solve. And when you bring Lewis into it, you see that he predicted we would continue to try to conquer nature, including our own bodies, including ourselves. Eventually, that would lead to the abolition, in other words, the eradication of man, of human beings ourselves. So when I say we need to know what it means to be human from a biblical perspective and defend that, it's because otherwise we're going to completely lose it. Obviously, as Christians, we know that we won't, but if we want a better future for our children and grandchildren that doesn't involve everybody uploading their mind to the cloud and thinking that that's where salvation lies, then we have to articulate what humanity really is and what it's for, and why transhumanism, as compelling as it might sound to people who don't have a spiritual grounding, how that's not ultimately the answer or our salvation. So check out the links. I encourage you to do some reading. Summer break's almost here, so if you're going to have more time on your hands soon, it would be a great time to dive into some of these ancient texts and older classic literature that can help us better understand the world that we're living in today. I'll see you next time on the Know Why podcast.